Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present by Robyn Maynard. Delving behind Canada's veneer of multiculturalism and tolerance, Policing Black Lives traces the violent realities of anti-Blackness from the slave ships to prisons, classrooms, and beyond. Robyn Maynard provides readers with the first comprehensive account of nearly 400 years of state-sanctioned surveillance, criminalization, and punishment of Black lives in Canada. Maynard's intersectional approach to anti-Black racism addresses the unique and understudied impacts of state violence as it is experienced by Black women, Black people with disabilities, as well as queer, trans, and undocumented Black communities. A call to action, Policing Black Lives urges readers to work towards dismantling structures of racial domination and reimagining a more just society. The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power by Desmond. A bracing, provocative, and perspective-shifting book from one of Canada's most celebrated and uncompromising writers, Desmond. The Skin We're In will spark a national conversation, influence policy, and inspire activists. In his 2015 cover story for Toronto Life magazine, Desmond exposed the racist actions of the Toronto police force, detailing the dozens of times he had been stopped and interrogated under the controversial practice of carding. The story quickly came to national prominence, shaking the country to its core and catapulting its author into the public sphere. Cole used his newfound profile to draw insistent, unyielding attention to the injustices faced by Black Canadians on a daily basis. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. In 2014, award-winning journalist Reni Eddo-Lodge wrote about her frustration with the way that discussions of race and racism in Britain were being led by those who weren't affected by it. She posted a piece on her blog entitled, "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race." Her words hit a nerve. The post went viral and comments flooded in from others desperate to speak up about their own experiences. Galvanized by this clear hunger for open discussion, she decided to dig into the source of these feelings. Exploring issues from eradicated Black history to the political purpose of white dominance, whitewashed feminism to the inextricable link between class and race, Reni Eddo-Lodge offers a timely and essential new framework for how to see, acknowledge, and counter racism. It is a searing, illuminating, absolutely necessary exploration of what it is to be a person of color in Britain today. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. In this breakout book, Oluo explores the complex reality of today's racial landscape, from white privilege and police brutality to systemic discrimination and the Black Lives Matter movement, offering straightforward clarity that readers need to contribute to the dismantling of the racial divide. Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. Americans like to insist that they are living in a post-racial, colorblind society. In fact, racist thought is alive and well. It has simply become more sophisticated and more insidious. In this deeply researched and fast-moving narrative, Kendi chronicles the entire story of anti-Black racist ideas and their staggering power over the course of American history. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Kendi's concept of anti-racism re-energizes and reshapes the conversation about racial justice in America, but even more fundamentally, points us toward liberating new ways of thinking about ourselves and each other. In this book, Kendi asks us to think about what an anti-racist society might look like and how we can play an active role in building it. He weaves together an electrifying combination of ethics, history, law, and science, bringing it all together with an engaging personal narrative of his own awakening to anti-racism. How to Be an Anti-Racist is an essential work for anyone who wants to go beyond an awareness of racism to the next step, contributing to the formation of a truly just and equitable society. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. A national bestseller when it first appeared in 1963, The Fire Next Time galvanized the nation and gave passionate voice to the emerging civil rights movement. At once a powerful evocation of James Baldwin's early life in Harlem and a disturbing examination of the consequences of racial injustice, the book is an intensely personal and provocative document. It consists of 2 letters written on the occasion of the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation that exhorts Americans, both black and white, to attack the terrible legacy of racism. Described by the New York Times Book Review as sermon, ultimatum, confession, deposition, testament, and chronicle, all presented in searing, brilliant prose, The Fire Next Time stands as a classic of our literature. The Fire This Time, edited by Jesmyn Ward. Award-winning author Jesmyn Ward knows that Baldwin's words ring as true as ever today. In response, she has gathered short essays, memoir, and a few essential poems to engage the question of race in the United States, and she has turned to some of her generation's most original thinkers and writers to give voice to their concerns. The Fire This Time is divided into 3 parts that shine a light on the darkest corners of our history, wrestle for current predicament, and envision a better future. Men We Read by Jesmyn Ward. In 5 years, Jesmyn Ward lost 5 men in her life, to drugs, accidents, suicide, and the bad luck that can follow people who live in poverty, particularly black men. Dealing with these losses, one after another, made Jesmyn ask the question, why? And as she began to write about the experience of living through all the dying, she realized the truth, and it took her breath away. Her brother and her friends all died because of who they were and where they were from, because they lived with a history of racism and economic struggle that fostered drug addiction and the dissolution of family and relationships. Jesmyn says the answer was so obvious she felt stupid for not seeing it, but it nagged at her until she knew she had to write about her community, to write their stories and her own. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In a profound work that pivots from the biggest questions about American history and ideals to the most intimate concerns of a father for his son, Ta-Nehisi Coates offers a powerful new framework for understanding our nation's history and current crisis. Americans have built an empire on the idea of race, a falsehood that damages us all, but falls most heavily on the bodies of black women and men. Bodies exploited through slavery and segregation, and, today, threatened, locked up, and murdered out of all proportion. What is it like to inhabit a black body and find a way to live within it? And how can we all honestly reckon with this fraught history and free ourselves from its burden? When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter Memoir by Patrisse Khan-Cullors and Asha Bandele. Raised by a single mother in an impoverished neighborhood in Los Angeles, Patrisse Khan-Cullors experienced firsthand the prejudice and persecution Black Americans endure at the hands of law enforcement. For Patrisse, the most vulnerable people in the country are Black people. Deliberately and ruthlessly targeted by a criminal justice system serving a white privilege agenda, Black people are subjected to unjustifiable racial profiling and police brutality. In 2013, when Trayvon Martin's killer went free, Patrisse's outrage led her to co-found Black Lives Matter with Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi. Condemned as terrorists and as a threat to America, these loving women founded a hashtag that birthed the movement to demand accountability from the authorities who continually turn a blind eye to the injustices inflicted upon people of Black and brown skin. Championing human rights in the face of violent racism, Patrisse is a survivor. She transformed her personal pain into political power, giving voice to a people suffering inequality and a movement fueled by her strength and love to tell the country and the world that Black lives matter. Heavy, an American memoir by Kiese Laymon. In Heavy, Laymon writes eloquently and honestly about growing up a hard-headed Black son to a complicated and brilliant Black mother in Jackson, Mississippi. From his early experiences of sexual violence, to his suspension from college, to his trek to New York as a young college professor, Laymon charts his complex relationship with his mother, grandmother, anorexia, obesity, sex, writing, and ultimately gambling. By attempting to name secrets and lies he and his mother spent a lifetime avoiding, Laymon asks himself, his mother, his nation, and us to confront the terrifying possibility that few in this nation actually know how to responsibly love, and even fewer want to live under the weight of actually becoming free. A personal narrative that illuminates national failures, heavy is defiant yet vulnerable, an insightful, often comical exploration of weight, identity, art, friendship, and family that begins with a confusing childhood and continues through 25 years of haunting implosions and long reverberations. Thick and Other Essays by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Tressie McMillan Cottom brilliantly shifts gears from running regression analysis on college data to unleashing another identity, a purveyor of wit, wisdom, and of course Black Twitter snark, about all that is right and much that is so very wrong about this thing we call society. In the best-selling tradition of Bell Hooks and Roxane Gay, McMillan Cottom's freshman collection illuminates a particular trait of her tribe, being thick, in form and in substance. McMillan Cottom has crafted a Black woman's cultural Bible, as she mines for meaning in places many of us miss and reveals precisely how, when you're in the thick of it, the political, the social, and the personal are almost always one and the same. How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. Haunted and Haunting, Jones's memoir tells the story of a young Black gay man from the South as he fights to carve out a place for himself within his family, within his country, within his own hopes, desires, and fears. Through a series of vignettes that share a course across the American landscape, Jones draws readers into his boyhood and adolescence, into tumultuous relationships with his mother and grandmother, into passing flings with lovers, friends, and strangers. Each piece builds into a larger examination of race and queerness, power and vulnerability, love and grief. A portrait of what we all do for one another and to one another as we fight to become ourselves. Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower by Brittany Cooper. Far too often, Black women's anger has been caricatured into an ugly and destructive force that threatens the civility and social fabric of American democracy. But Cooper shows us that there is more to the story than that. Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston. In 1927 and 1931, Zora Neale Hurston went to Plateau, Alabama to interview 86-year-old Cudjo Lewis. Of the millions of men, women, and children transported from Africa to America as slaves, Cudjo was then the only person alive to tell the story of this integral part of the nation's history. Based on those interviews, featuring Cudjo's unique vernacular and written from Hurston's perspective with the compassion and singular style that have made her one of the preeminent American authors of the 20th century, Barracoon masterfully illustrates the tragedy of slavery and of one life forever defined by it. The Source of Self-Regard, Selected Essays, Speeches, and Meditations by Toni Morrison. This book is divided into 3 parts. The first is introduced by a powerful prayer to the dead of 9/11. The second by a searching meditation on Martin Luther King Jr., and the last by a heart-wrenching eulogy for James Baldwin. In the writings and speeches included here, Morrison takes on contested social issues: the foreigner, female empowerment, the press, money, Black matters, and human rights. Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches by AUDRE LORDE. Presenting the essential writings of Black lesbian poet and feminist writer AUDRE LORDE, Sister Outsider celebrates an influential voice in 20th century literature. In this charged collection of 15 essays and speeches, LORDE takes on sexism, racism, ageism, homophobia, and class, and propounds social difference as a vehicle for action and change. Her prose is incisive, unflinching, and lyrical, reflecting struggle but ultimately offering messages of hope. Talking Back, Thinking Feminist, Thinking Black by Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks writes about the meaning of feminist consciousness in daily life and about self-recovery, about overcoming white and male supremacy, and about intimate relationships, exploring the point where the public and private meet. Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. A powerful study of the women's movement in the U.S. from abolitionist days to the present that demonstrates how it has always been hampered by the racist and classist biases of its leaders. ASSATA, an autobiography. This intensely personal and political autobiography belies the fearsome image of Joanne Chesimard long projected by the media and the state. With wit and candor, ASSATA Shakur recounts the experiences that led her to a life of activism and portrays the strengths, weaknesses, and eventual demise of Black and white revolutionary groups at the hand of government officials. The Autobiography of Malcolm X by Malcolm X and Alex Haley. Through a life of passion and struggle, Malcolm X became one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. In this riveting account, he tells of his journey from a prison cell to the Mecca, describing his transition from hoodlum to Muslim minister. Here, the man who called himself the angriest Black man in America relates how his conversion to true Islam helped him confront his rage and recognize the brotherhood of all mankind. Me and White Supremacy. Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor by Layla F. Saad. When Layla Saad began an Instagram challenge called #Me and White Supremacy, she never predicted it would spread as widely as it did. She encouraged people to own up and share their racist behaviors, big and small. She was looking for truth, and she got it. Thousands of people participated in the challenge, and nearly 100,000 people downloaded the Me and White Supremacy workbook. Updated and expanded from the original workbook, Me and White Supremacy takes the work deeper by adding more historical and cultural context, sharing moving stories and anecdotes, and including expanded definitions, examples, and further resources. Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mikki Kendall. In her stirring collection of essays, Mikki Kendall takes aim at the legitimacy of the modern feminist movement, arguing that it has chronically failed to address the needs of all but a few women. Drawing on her own experiences of hunger, violence, and hypersexualization, along with incisive commentary on politics, pop culture, the stigma of mental health, and more, Hood Feminism delivers an irrefutable indictment of a movement in flux. Motherhood So White, a memoir of race, gender, and parenting in America by Nefertiti Austin. Motherhood So White is the story of Austin's fight to create the family she always knew she was meant to have, and the story of motherhood that all American families need now. In this unflinching account of her parenting journey, Austin examines the history of adoption in the African American community, faces off against stereotypes of single Black motherhood, and confronts the reality of raising children of color in a racially charged modern-day America. Born a Crime, Stories from a South African Childhood by Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah's unlikely path from apartheid South Africa to the desk of The Daily Show began with a criminal act, his birth. Trevor was born to a white Swiss father and a Black Xhosa mother at a time when such a union was punishable by 5 years in prison. Living proof of his parents' indiscretion, Trevor was kept mostly indoors for the earliest years of his life, bound by the extreme and often absurd measures his mother took to hide him from a government that could, at any moment, steal him away. Finally liberated by the end of South Africa's tyrannical white rule, Trevor and his mother set forth on a grand adventure, living openly and freely and embracing the opportunities won by a centuries-long struggle. Well-read Black Girl, Finding Our Stories, Discovering Ourselves, edited by Glory Edim. Remember that moment when you first encountered a character who seemed to be written just for you? That feeling of belonging can stick with readers the rest of their lives, but it doesn't come around as frequently for all of us. In this timely anthology, Well-Read Black Girl, Gloria Dean brings together original essays by some of our best Black female writers and creative voices to shine a light on how we search for ourselves in literature, and how important it is that everyone, no matter their gender, race, religion, or abilities, can find themselves there. Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity, Love, and So Much More, by Janet Mock. This powerful memoir follows Mock's quest for identity, from an early, unwavering conviction about her gender to a turbulent adolescence in Honolulu that saw her transitioning during the tender years of high school, self-medicating with hormones at 15, and flying across the world alone for sex reassignment surgery at just 18. With unflinching honesty, Mock uses her own experience to impart vital insight about the unique challenges and vulnerabilities of trans youth and brave girls like herself. More Than Enough, Claiming Space for Who You Are, No Matter What They Say, by Elaine Welteroth. In this part manifesto, part memoir, the revolutionary editor who infused social consciousness into the pages of Teen Vogue explores what it means to come into your own on your own terms. Throughout her life, Elaine Welteroth has climbed the ranks of media and fashion, shattering ceilings along the way. In this riveting and timely memoir, the groundbreaking journalist unpacks lessons on race, identity, and success through her own journey, from navigating her way as the unstoppable child of an unlikely interracial marriage in small-town California, to finding herself on the front lines of a modern movement for the next generation of changemakers. Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine, by Emily Bernard. In these 12 deeply personal, connected essays, Bernard details the experience of growing up Black in the South with a family name inherited from a white man, surviving a random stabbing at a New Haven coffee shop, marrying a white man from the North and bringing him home to her family, adopting 2 children from Ethiopia, and living and teaching in a primarily white New England college town. Each of these essays sets out to discover a new way of talking about race and of telling the truth as the author has lived it. Citizen, An American Lyric, by Claudia Rankin. Rankin's bold new book recounts mounting racial aggressions in ongoing encounters in 21st century daily life and in the media. Some of these encounters are slights, seeming slips of the tongue, and some are intentional offensives in the classroom, at the supermarket, at home, on the tennis court. In essay, image, and poetry, Citizen is a powerful testament to the individual and collective effects of racism in our contemporary, often named post-race society. Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada, edited by Ronnie DeVerlis, Sandy Hudson, and Cyrus Marcus Ware. This anthology is a comprehensive compendium focusing on the most urgent issues facing Canada's Black community today. Edited by core and founding members of Black Lives Matter Toronto, this book contains essays by and conversations with artists, educators, scholars, activists, and community leaders about Black resistance and liberation, describing the latest developments in Canadian Black activism and organizing efforts. Black Life, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom, by Rinaldo Walcott and Idil Abdullahi. Black Life seeks to place the activist work of Black Lives Matter Toronto in a broader context of Black Canadian activists, struggles, and Black struggles globally. In this work, BLM's intervention into the Toronto political realm marks a discontinuous Black Canadian activism that erupts and wanes in response to local, national, and international Black protest. One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy by Carol Anderson. Anderson follows the astonishing story of government-dictated racial discrimination unfolding before our very eyes as more and more states adopt voter suppression laws. In gripping, enlightening detail, she explains how voter suppression works, from photo ID requirements to gerrymandering to poll closures. And with vivid characters, she explores the resistance, the organizing, activism, and court battles to restore the basic right to vote to all Americans as the nation gears up for the 2018 midterm elections. White Rage: The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. As Ferguson, Missouri erupted in August 2014, and media commentators across the ideological spectrum referred to the angry response of African Americans as Black Rage, historian Carol Anderson wrote a remarkable op-ed in the Washington Post showing that this was, indeed, white rage at work. With so much attention on the flames, she writes, everyone had ignored the kindling. Since 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, every time African Americans have made advances towards full participation in our democracy, white reaction has fueled a deliberate and relentless rollback of their gains. Carefully linking these and other historical flashpoints when social progress for African Americans was countered by deliberate and cleverly crafted opposition, Anderson pulls back the veil that has long covered actions made in the name of protecting democracy, fiscal responsibility, or protection against fraud, rendering visible the long lineage of white rage. Compelling and dramatic in the unimpeachable history it relates, white rage will add an important new dimension to the national conversation about race in America. Killing the Black Body: Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty by Dorothy Roberts. In 1997, this groundbreaking book made a powerful entrance into the national conversation on race. In a media landscape dominated by racially biased images of welfare queens and crack babies, Killing the Black Body exposed America's systemic abuse of Black women's bodies, from slave masters' economic stake in bonded women's fertility to government programs that coerced thousands of poor Black women into being sterilized as late as the 1970s. These abuses pointed to the degradation of Black motherhood and the exclusion of Black women's reproductive needs in mainstream feminist and civil rights agendas. Now, some 2 decades later, Killing the Black Body has not only exerted profound influence, but also remains as crucial as ever, a rallying cry for education, awareness, and action on extending reproductive justice to all women. Just Mercy: A Story of Justice and Redemption by Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson was a young lawyer when he founded the Equal Justice Initiative, a legal practice dedicated to defending those most desperate and in need: the poor, the wrongly condemned, and women and children trapped in the farthest reaches of our criminal justice system. One of his first cases was that of Walter McMillian, a young man who was sentenced to die for a notorious murder he insisted he didn't commit. The case drew Bryan into a tangle of conspiracy, political machination, and legal brinksmanship, and transformed his understanding of mercy and justice forever. The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. In this incisive critique, former litigator turned legal scholar Michelle Alexander provocatively argues that we have not ended racial caste in America. We have simply redesigned it. Alexander shows that, by targeting Black men and decimating communities of color, the U.S. criminal justice system functions as a contemporary system of racial control, even as it formally adheres to the principle of colorblindness. The New Jim Crow challenges the civil rights community and all of us, to place mass incarceration at the forefront of a new movement for racial justice in America. The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. In this epic, beautifully written masterwork, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Isabel Wilkerson chronicles one of the great untold stories of American history, the decades-long migration of Black citizens who fled the South for northern and western cities in search of a better life. Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present, by Harriet A. Washington. The product of years of prodigious research into medical journals and experimental reports long undisturbed, Medical Apartheid reveals the hidden underbelly of scientific research and makes possible, for the first time, an understanding of the roots of the African American health deficit. At last, it provides the fullest possible context for comprehending the behavioral fallout that has caused Black Americans to view researchers, and indeed the whole medical establishment, with such deep distrust. White Negroes, When Cornrows Were in Vogue, and Other Thoughts on Cultural Appropriation, by Lauren Michelle Jackson. American culture loves Blackness. From music and fashion to activism and language, Black culture constantly achieves worldwide influence. Yet, when it comes to who is allowed to thrive from Black hipness, the pioneers are usually left behind as Black aesthetics are converted into mainstream success and white profit. Weaving together narrative, scholarship, and critique, Lauren Michelle Jackson reveals why cultural appropriation, something that's become embedded in our daily lives, deserves serious attention. Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, by Monique W. Morris. Just 16% of female students in the USA, Black girls make up more than 1/3 of all girls with a school-related arrest. The first book to tell these untold stories, Push Out exposes a world of confined potential and supports the growing movement to address the policies, practices, and cultural illiteracy that push countless students out of school and into unhealthy, unstable, and often unsafe futures. A Bound Woman is a Dangerous Thing, The Incarceration of African American Women from Harriet Tubman to Sandra Bland, by Damaris B. Hill. From Harriet Tubman to Assata Shakur, Ida B. Wells to Sandra Bland, and Black Lives Matter, Black women freedom fighters have braved violence, scorn, despair, and isolation in order to lodge their protests. In this book, Damaris Hill honors their experiences with at times harrowing, at times hopeful responses to her heroes, illustrated with Black and white photographs throughout. Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, by Peniel E. Joseph. Drawing on original archival research and more than 60 original oral histories, this narrative history vividly invokes the way in which Black power redefined Black identity and culture, and in the process redrew the landscape of American race relations. Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, by Dorothy Roberts. A decade after the Human Genome Project proved that human beings are not naturally divided by race, the emerging fields of personalized medicine, reproductive technologies, genetic genealogy, and DNA databanks are attempting to resuscitate race as a biological category written in our genes. In this provocative analysis, leading legal scholar and social critic Dorothy Roberts argues that America is once again at the brink of a virulent outbreak of classifying population by race. By searching for differences at the molecular level, a new race-based science is obscuring racism in our society and legitimizing state brutality against communities of color at a time when America claims to be post-racial. The Poisoned City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy by Anna Clark. When the people of Flint, Michigan, turned on their faucets in April 2014, the water pouring out was poisoned with lead and other toxins. Through a series of disastrous decisions, the state government had switched the city's water to a source that corroded Flint's aging lead pipes. Complaints about the foul-smelling water were dismissed. The residents of Flint, a largely poor African-American city of about 100,000 people, were not seen as credible, even in matters of their own lives. They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement, by Wesley Lowery. Conducting hundreds of interviews during the course of over 1 year reporting on the ground, Washington Post writer Wesley Lowery traveled from Ferguson, Missouri to Cleveland, Ohio, Charleston, South Carolina, and Baltimore, Maryland, and then back to Ferguson to uncover life inside the most heavily policed, if otherwise neglected, corners of America today. The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, by Richard Rothstein. In this groundbreaking history of the modern American metropolis, Richard Rothstein, a leading authority on housing policy, explodes the myth that America's cities came to be racially divided through de facto segregation, that is, through individual prejudices, income differences, or the actions of private institutions like banks and real estate agencies. Rather, the book incontrovertibly makes clear that it was the laws and policy decisions passed by local, state, and federal governments that actually promoted the discriminatory patterns that continue to this day. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, by Robyn DiAngelo. Referring to the defensive moves that white people make when challenged racially, white fragility is characterized by emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and by behaviors including argumentation and silence. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium and prevent any meaningful cross-racial dialogue. In this in-depth exploration, anti-racist educator Robyn DiAngelo examines how white fragility develops, how it protects racial inequality, and what can be done to engage more constructively. Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland, by Jonathan M. Metzl. Physician Jonathan M. Metzl's quest to understand the health implications of backlash governance leads him across America's heartland. Interviewing a range of everyday Americans, he examines how racial resentment has fueled pro-gun laws in Missouri, resistance to the Affordable Care Act in Tennessee, and cuts to schools and social services in Kansas. And he shows these policies' costs: increasing deaths by gun suicide, rising dropout rates, and falling life expectancies. White Americans, Metzl argues, must reject the racial hierarchies that promise to aid them but in fact lead our nation to demise.